Hi, everybody. I hope you are doing well and you are staying safe and healthy. I know this year has been very hard on everybody and we're all undergoing an enormous amount of stress right now. I know today, especially, I'm feeling that stress, and I just wanted to quickly take a break from work that I'm doing in my studio to just do something slightly different. So the idea behind this is to create just some simple watercolor heart designs that can go out to members of the community that are, feeling particularly vulnerable. Everybody needs to have a little bit of recognition and care right now. So hopefully these can go out to anybody that just needs a little bit of positive encouragement. Nothing really more than that. I mean, it's still just a painting, but sometimes those little things really can make a difference. So today, if you'd like, you can follow along with the tutorial and you can come up with your own watercolor design. Or if you don't have watercolors, you're welcome to use things like crayons or markers, pencils, acrylics, whatever you have on hand. It's totally up to you. So the thing that I have today is just an example of one of the pieces that I've done in the past. This is one that I wouldn't give away to somebody in the community just because of this little section right here, which I feel like has cut off this little heart in half. So I'm going to use this as a reference for some of the work I'm doing today. And I also have a little heart cutout that I created just from a piece of paper. And an easy way to do that is just like that traditional method that you always see in like kids classes where you can fold up a piece of paper and then cut it out with a pair of scissors. So, there's nothing really fancy to doing that part of this design. So I have a few things on hand that I'm using. I'm just using some standard watercolor paper. And most of these are scraps that I've had around the studio. I tend to keep all of my scraps for whatever reason. I'm kind of a hoarder of art materials, but it does come in handy when you do projects like this, where you're either wanting to practice or just work on something a little bit smaller. So I have some of these that are already traced out using my little cutout of my heart. And I just did that with a pencil, nothing fancy. And then after I traced it out, I erased the majority of those lines so they wouldn't be visible while I'm painting. And especially with watercolor painting, it tends to be transparent. So if you have any of these graphite lines or marker lines or anything like that, it's going to show through. I also have some scrap pieces here that I'll be using just to show you how to do certain techniques with your brush if you're interested. And I have this palette, my Winsor & Newton palette that has been through so much lately. I'm sorry, it's a total mess right now, but I use this almost every day. And so I'm probably going to use some of these leftover paints and things in here that I can just use the scraps from that so I don't waste anything. I also have some tube watercolors that I've used, and you just need really your primary colors for this. And I added just a few other little elements. So I have some lemon yellow, some cadmium yellow, cadmium red, turquoise blue, sap green, which isn't necessary. You can definitely mix that color from some of the other ones, and ultramarine blue. So you don't need to have these specific things, just whatever you have on hand will work as long as it's within that primary color range. And if you don't know what a primary color is, that's basically the colors that most of our other colors are based off of. So you have any variation of yellow, red, or blue that will work to mix together to create new colors. But yeah, I'll go over more of that in just a minute. I'm not trying to get too detailed in this because this isn't really a traditional class. This is just to have fun and have a small distraction from stressful feelings. I also have some other brushes that I'm using. So some of these I may or may not use, but just a variety of round brushes for watercolor or whatever material you're using will work for you. And again, a pencil and some paper towels and a cup. That's all the other things you need. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is start to figure out where I want my little flowers to go within my little watercolor heart design. So typically what you want to do with compositions or like the structure of your design is to try and prevent everything from being right dead in the center, because that tends to just draw your eye into the piece and kind of kill any of the movement that might happen around your design. So this is where this piece right here becomes more of a distraction because it draws your eye in. So we're going to take this little section out here. Like I said earlier, it's just a reference photo. So you can figure out where you want your little flowers or any other elements of your design to go in. Again, just try and avoid that dead center of your little heart. So what I'm going to do is use some of my cadmium red that I have and just one of my brushes. This is just the number 4 round that I will start plotting in that design with. So if it's straight out of the tube like this, you always have to dilute it with a little bit of water because it's just too thick of a paint to use. So I'm just going to dip my my brush in my water. And I'm just going to take a tiny bit of this red because this is really pigmented with the professional colors. And I'm going to just follow this one pretty closely so you have an idea of how to do this piece. So for this part, what I'll do is I'll just create a little, almost like a teardrop shape. And I'm following closely to this pattern I have for my heart shape right around here. I'm just going to make that slightly darker. And we're painting directly on dry paper, so this is considered the wet on dry technique. So you do one of those, and then you're going to do one in the opposite direction. You can see right here how there's one just in that spot. But instead of connecting them, we're going to leave a little bit of space between these two shapes. So it's just meant to mirror each other. And again, if you need to put a little bit more pigment in there for your design to really make that red pop, go ahead and do that while it's still damp on the paper. And watercolors tend to dry a little bit lighter than they are when you initially put it on your paper just because it's soaking into the material. So if you need to, you can always go back and really make those red colors stand out. So I'm also going to plot in a few of these other ones here with just these little teardrop shapes. And it's going to look a little strange until we start connecting in the rest of the petals of the poppy. So no need to worry, you're probably doing it just fine. So I'm going to put another one right here. And then again, the opposite or mirror effect with that other little teardrop shape. Make sure again, you leave a little bit of a gap between those two. I'm also going to do this other one up here, and you'll see that I'm trying to have a little bit of movement with those petals so they're not all in the exact same direction. So I'll have another one right up here. And some of these might not come out exactly how I want them to, especially if I'm not planning too far into my design. But again, this is just meant to relieve some stress and just do something positive. Typically, I would have a lot more planned, but I'm just not into that today for whatever reason. It's just too much going on, I think, in my head. Okay. I'll also do another one down here. Again, we're avoiding that dead center area of our painting, just so we have a little bit of movement around the shape. We're trying to emphasize that little heart shape with the rest of our elements of our painting. And some of these can be a little bit smaller if you want a little bit of variety with the shapes. And I'm just going to do one more up here. I'm just going to have them all be these open flowers. This one originally had it where it's like pulled over, like almost like an umbrella with the way that the poppies are typically like in nature. Since they're on such like little spindly stems, they tend to start being like pushed over with the weight of the petals. So instead of doing that design, I'm just going to keep them all the same, just for a change. Okay. So again, it's going to look a little strange until we start adding in those other elements. So I'm just going to go ahead and plot in a few more of these on my other colors, or I'm sorry, on my other hearts. And I can move them around however I want. If I want to have them slightly different, some can have more flowers than others if you want there to be more of like this foliage or leaf patterns. So go ahead and go with your gut. We're working really small anyway, which, you know, if something happens where you don't really love the design, really all you're losing is just a little bit of your time. Most likely you already have some of these scraps at home if you do painting in general, or really any arts and crafts. But working smaller can sometimes be a little bit trickier because you have to be a little bit tighter with your brush strokes. So just be aware of that while you're working. If you feel like you're holding your brush a little bit too tight, you'll feel it in your hand. You'll start getting cramps and things. So just try and loosen up your grip and just enjoy the painting process when you can. Okay. And some of these can go over that little heart shape if you want there to be even more movement. So it can break that little boundary of this heart shape. Sometimes that looks really nice when you do that too. It's a little bit close, but that's okay. Now, if you're working with pan watercolors like these, you usually have to activate them with a little bit of water first. So sometimes if you have like a little eyedropper tool or a misting spray, like a hair bottle, like hairspray bottle or something like that, you can use that on these. Or you can just activate them with a little bit of water from your brush. And you'll get that same effect with it too. So again, just use whatever you have. But the more pigments that you put on there, obviously the darker this is going to be. So sometimes you just have to add a little bit more water than normal to activate that paint. And then you can choose how pigmented you want that to be or like thick that paint is going to be. I'm just going to leave that right there. Okay. And I'm just going to do one more of these since I have these 3 scraps of paper. Like I said, I'll probably do more of these when I have slightly more time. Because I have a lot of classes that I'm getting ready to roll out. But again, this is just a quick thing to do before I have to get back to my other work. Now, it might help to use a smaller brush than what I'm using too. So if you have other things on hand that you're more comfortable using, feel free to do that. You don't have to follow this exactly. And just work at your own pace. I know I'm kind of speeding through this. But again, the whole idea is just to do something that relieves some stress and is just something really just nice to do. Okay. So I'm going to clean my brush. And I'm going to go back to my first one that I did, which is this one right here. You can see it's already mostly dried on the paper, and you can see how different those colors can be, where they're slightly more diluted or softer because they've kind of soaked into that paper. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull some of this color away from these two petals to complete the rest of this piece. So usually I just start with a little bit of water on my brush, and I'll create just a little curved shape. And since this is still watercolor, it can easily be activated by touching some of that other petal that we just created. So it'll immediately create more of like that pinky shape, or I'm sorry, pinky tone to it, where it's just slightly more diluted. Now, if you want it to be a little bit stronger of a petal, you can dip into a little bit of your red. And anywhere where you have that water that's on the piece of paper, your pigment is going to move around with it. So you can create some really nice variations of light and dark with your reds, where some of it can be a little bit more transparent than others. And you can use the edge of your brush to kind of move that around into areas where you want there to be a little bit more red. And I'm still avoiding the center here. And these are definitely more simplified petals. If I wanted to do more of like a traditional poppy, I would make it a little bit more tissuey and delicate. But since we're working so small, it's just easier to kind of keep those shapes a little bit simple, or more simple at the moment. But if you're working on a larger piece, you can definitely add more details. Okay. Do the same thing here. I'm just going to use a clean, wet brush and just create these little C shapes or curves that connect those two petals together. And if I need to, I can take just a little bit of my red pigment to move that around. And this one dried a slightly lighter, so I'm going to fill in some of that red too, just to make it a little bit deeper with that color. If you need to, you can always scoop up some. If you feel like you put too much on there, you can just use the edge of your brush and mop that up, and that will help you pull up any of that pigment that you might not want. So most of these flowers are quite large, so I'm curious how this one's going to turn out. Probably should have gone a tiny bit smaller with them, but that's okay. I said it's not going to hurt anything if they don't come out exactly the way I want them to. You can just always make more. So I'm gonna let that one sit and dry before I do any more work with it. And I can just keep working on these other ones using the same exact technique. Again, we're just using a little bit of clean water on our brush to create that connection between those other petals. Now I'll probably do some more adjustments to these as I go, but for right now, they look pretty good so far. So typically what I'll do towards the end after I do other elements of my painting is I'll just really make these other petals stand out even more and make sure that there's enough transition there with those colors. But without having the center point of them, sometimes it's difficult to see what you need to do with the rest of your flowers. So I'm gonna do one more. And then I will move forward with some of those leaf designs. And this one will probably be a little bit better out of the three just because some of these little petals are slightly smaller. But I might just be being a little bit picky too. I've had to make a lot of these in, or recently, especially for the holidays and stuff coming up. So each of them are always like slightly different. So it makes it fun to work on. And again, you can use whatever colors that you want for the flowers. They don't have to be this poppy color. I just know like with November, the poppy has more symbolism, especially in this region, dealing with Armistice Day and World War I. So it's just a way to recognize that and the importance of that event. And I love the story behind it, where the poppies are sprouting up on these horrible battlegrounds and creating this really good sign of, you know, healing and change. There's a lot of metaphors for those in history, especially relating to war and battles, but I just find that one really beautiful and inspiring. And the poppy in itself is just such a beautiful flower. So I just like to use that in a lot of my work. So again, just make sure you're avoiding that center area because we want some of that color of the paper shining through. And watercolors have this really beautiful reflective nature to them since they're transparent. So their interaction with that white background is going to make a huge difference with how your overall painting will turn out. So it's part of why I love about watercolors in general. They're quite forgiving. As long as you don't, overwork a design, you can really build upon layers of it and create just really beautiful paintings. But a key to it is making sure you leave some of that white of the paper within your design. If I were to cover over this entire heart, it sometimes works, but usually just having that little bit of white popping through makes everything feel cohesive. And part of that is because you don't really use white in watercolor traditionally, even though I like to include it sometimes. But it's just a way, again, of ensuring that the painting isn't just sitting on top of your paper. There's a connection between the two. So those are just rules, they can always be broken. I've seen people do really amazing things that don't follow any of the watercolor rules. So it's yours to decide while you're working. Okay, so I'm gonna let those sit and dry, and I'm gonna go back to my original one. I believe it was this one. Yeah, that other one's drying a little bit. And they don't have to be completely dry, but if you're going to add other elements of green and things there, they will start pulling into any other areas that might be wet on your paper. So sometimes that creates a really beautiful connection between the colors, or sometimes it can make the colors muddy depending on how things go with it. So for this one, I'm just going to follow this design closely as an example. Okay. So typically what I like to plot in are some of these bigger shapes. So you can see here I have this bright kind of eucalyptus or foliage that's happening in the background. This one has slightly bigger flowers to it, so I might do something just slightly different for that section. But if you have an area of your painting that has a lot of distance between the flowers, having some of these bigger leaves and foliage really brings everything together. And then you also want to follow the pattern of the shape too, so you can have leaves that are kind of rounding out based on that curve of the heart shape. So I'm just going to show you how to mix a few colors using what we have, because you can make a variety of greens just using yellow and blue and variations of those colors. So if you have a warm blue or a cool blue, all of that will make a new color for you. So if I combine my lemon yellow and some of my ultramarine blue, that comes up with a really pretty green. And I like to keep things a little bit transparent too, because that again will be able to allow you to build layers of leaves and foliage within your heart. I also like to have some cool toned greens, so I have a little bit more ultramarine blue there instead of this yellow. And then if you do cadmium yellow and that ultramarine blue, it's going to create more of like a mossy green color. Like that. So you can always have it be a little bit darker if you want, because essentially this is pretty much this color here if I were to just use my sap green. Yeah, that one's just slightly more olive colored, if you can see that. I also have this cobalt blue that I like to include with designs like this just because we have those vibrant red colors. It's nice to add some other playful colors to it. So you can always mix your lemon yellow in that if you want a really vibrant green, which always looks really pretty. Or you can mix it with some of your cadmium yellow. That will also make a really vibrant green color. So again, you can experiment with all of these colors however you'd like. Just know that, you know, you can always add a little bit of water to it to make it slightly more transparent, and that will build on your color palette. So you don't need a huge variety of colors like we're seeing right here. You really just need some of your primary colors and variation of, you know, more water or less water, or more blue versus less blue in your colors. Hopefully that makes sense. I'll have more coming out with color theory and stuff soon, because that's one of my biggest questions that I get from people. And what I usually just tell them is to experiment, use some scrap paper and, you know, do little swatches and learn about how to mix those colors. And a lot of times I'll just create a color chart based on that, where I can use that as a reference. And those get a little bit crazy based on how OCD I think I'm feeling that day. But it really does teach you a lot. Nothing really can speed up the process of learning. You just have to experiment with your materials. Okay, so another thing I'm just going to show you is how to quickly use your brush. Like I said, this isn't a full class, so I'm just making sure that I don't go crazy over my time with this, because again, this is just meant to be fun. But you have different types of brushes, so the amount of, you know, pigment that's held within what's known as like this belly of the brush right here is going to change the shape of your leaves. So a quick thing to show you, I'm just going to dip into my green right here because that'll be fast, is I can load up my paintbrush with a good amount of pigment and a little bit of water. And a lot of times if you're using that, you have a little bit too much water that's on your brush. So to get rid of some of that excess water, you can just tap it onto your paper towel. And that way you have a little bit more control over your brush strokes that you're using. And usually I'll just start with just like the tip of my brush here, and I'll press down and pull and then lift back up quickly. And then I can make a leaf shape from that. You can see like that. Now this one is more of like a rounded edge to it. You can see on the end of the brush here. So if I were to use more of a pointed round brush like you see here, that's going to have a completely different look to it. So I'm going to load that up with paint, tap off any excess on my paper towel, use the tip of my brush that I press with first, push down, pull, and then lift back up. And that gives me a thinner, like pointier leaf. You can also hold your brush in opposite directions and just press down that way. And you can create some leaf shapes like that. And just connect them with some stems. If you can see that okay. So there's all sorts of things you can do for it. And then the other thing typically is I'll do what's known as like the rule of thirds, where with my leaves, I can have them in sections of 3 that just branch off into other sections. And that creates a more natural looking branch or leaves for your design, like that. And again, if I turn my brush in the opposite direction, I'm going to get a totally different appearance to it. That's where you get more of those rounded or curved leaves. And then again, you can just connect them with the stem. And to create the stem, I usually just use a smaller brush or just a really pointed brush. So this is like a number 1 or 0. Again, you can load it up with your paint, tap off any excess on your paper towel. And then using just the tip of your brush, you can create some really thin and wispy lines like that. And then you can also use the end of that to create some little leaf patterns by using that same technique where you press down, pull, and then pick back up. Okay. All right, so I am going to start with this one. And I'm just going to use this number 4 round. This is kind of my go-to for everything. And I have a lot of leftover of this greenish blue color, so I'm going to use some of that. I might just use a tiny bit of that cobalt blue with it to really brighten that up. And to create, again, these rounded leaves, you can do a variety of things. Sometimes people will create more of like that wider teardrop shape like that to create a eucalyptus plant, or you can use a curve of that brush where you're using more of the belly of the brush to sweep over that section. And that will also create that eucalyptus shape. And some people will also just trace things out with their pencil first before they get started. But I'm just gonna go with it. And since things are overlapping, I can just have them pushed behind a flower or in front of the flower, depending on how you want your design to look. And I'm just going to follow this all the way down with just some other little shapes here or there to break that up. Like I said, these are slightly bigger flowers than I normally do for these designs, but that's fine. And then I can switch to my smaller brush to create that stem that connects everything together. And I'm just going to draw that all the way down. Now you can always change things up by adding a slightly different color into these damp sections. So if I were to go into a little bit of my lemon yellow, I can drop that into that other color to create a more vibrant looking color. And this is known as a variegated wash. I love using this for flowers because you can see how that little bit of color, I'll try and show that even more on screen. If you tap that into there, both of those colors are going to blend together to create a new one. So it's a really easy way to play with color and create some really beautiful textures and changes within it. That's where you can see along here. And within these shapes right here, there's several different colors that are intertwined. Okay. So another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use more of my pointed round brush, and I'm going to create these larger leaf petals back here. And this is mostly with this color. I'm going to add a little bit of lemon yellow just to brighten that up a little bit. And a tad bit of this blue. I always want to mix some elements of the other colors together to create some cohesive color ranges together. It's a really easy way to create balance within it. Okay. Tap off any excess water. I'm just going to use the tip of my brush and then press down and then pull up. You can also use your brush to pull some of that color down towards the base of that shape, and that will create a really beautiful leaf pattern. And I'm mostly just following the shape that I have for my heart here. So I can have these leaves going in a different direction just to fill some of that space. And I also like to leave some of them open-ended where you can use just 2 curved lines together to create that open looking petal or leaf like that. Now I'm going to add some ultramarine blue to this just to make it a little bit more of a deeper color. And the idea is to not have two exact colors near each other. You always want them to be slightly different. So one can be a little bit more transparent, one can be a little bit darker. I'm gonna go ahead and add in the stems of my poppies, which I haven't done yet. So they need to feel like they're planted within the space. And again, you're welcome to overlap things as long as they're not the exact same color. I'm also just going to create some little stems and things coming off of that section, just to make it feel like there's more going on with the poppies. I need a little bit to fill this in. I'm almost getting this heart shape that I need. So I'm going to do, I think I'm going to go darker again. Actually, this is a really pretty blue. Yeah, that might look nice with that too. So again, just make sure your colors aren't exactly the same if they're overlapping or near each other. And those are kind of similar. So I'm just going to drop in a slightly different color within these. You can see I'm just dropping some of that lemon yellow in there just to change that up a little bit. And again, I'm just following more of the shape of this heart here. So there's a few little areas where I need to put something in. And typically at the base of this, you can see here where I have a little bit heavier lines and colors to feel like this is more firmly planted in the piece. So if I were to go quite a bit darker with my color, add a little bit of red to this, create more of like a muted bluish greenish gray. It'll be pretty. I can just tap in with my brush a few little areas. And this is known as scumbling, where you're just tapping in a tiny bit of that darker color in sections. So some of that white can show through, but it makes it feel like it's a little bit more firmly planted. And you can do that in other sections too if you want to add a little bit of foliage. And I think I need some of this lighter green in sections. So I'm just, again, building on whatever colors I have in there. I tap in some of that lighter color too in here, just to break up some of that green. And that's almost done. So if you want, you can go really dark in spots and add in a few other accents. I'm going to go darker with my colors just because I need to create these little dots for the center of my poppies. So to do that, I'm going to mix some of my ultramarine blue and a little bit of my cadmium red. And that's going to create a really deep purpley black. So I don't like to use just solid black in any of my work unless I absolutely have to, because it tends to dull the colors. So if you mix some of your primary colors together, even just mixing your red, yellow, and blue together will create that neutral grayish black color that you'll need. But for this one, since I already have red and some blue tones to it, I just like to use this really deep purple. And I'm just going to tap in there in a few sections to create those little poppy seeds within the center of my flowers. And that's usually where I can see if I need to add anything else to my design or just leave it as it is. That's pretty close to being done. So I think what I'll do is just have a little bit more happening in just some of these other sections. So I'll add in a little bit more of my darker color with just the tiniest lines, because I'm not trying to overpower the rest of the piece. Because you can overwork this with too many things if you're not careful. So you have to figure out where your stopping point is for your design. But that looks pretty good. And then what I usually do is I'll just sign my name or something under there if I want to share that with anybody. But I hope that helps. I'm going to continue doing more of these with just different lines and shapes. But if you'd like, I'd love to see if you decide to do more painting. I'd love to see how they turn out. Okay, I hope you enjoy the rest of your night. Thank you so much.